Going to like to call to order our meeting of the January 9th, 2024 Finance and Budget Committee. So, you can take roll.
Councilmember Kelly,
Here.
Committee Member McMillan,
Here.
Councilmember Wynn,
Here.
Councilmember Nusma,
Here.
Committee Member Rikus,
Here.
Chair Livingston.
Here. Very good. So we have a quorum, and we will go next into public. I don't know who is there. Mike, Jess, doesn't appear to have any council members online. Okay, very good. So why don't we go to public comment? Okay, very good.
Good evening. I'm Jeff Perini, Second Ward. And just a couple of quick comments here is that, at least as a resident, how I view this committee here as kind of certainly a group that provides financial scrutiny for the city, for the budget,
Recording in progress.
for its budget. And of course, that means the totality of the numbers, but not only that, what the money is being spent upon and how it's being spent as well. And, you have a level of financial acumen here that the residents don't have. You represent the residents. And so I would ask you, when you look at the budget and see things like we've reviewed recently about being 10 years behind in sidewalk repair and things like that, that this is the group with the most ability to ask why, and maybe to dig into some of those numbers a little bit and help staff, finally do that. I'm sure that, I don't recall sidewalks being an issue being brought up repeatedly in the past at 2 years behind, 4 years behind, whatever. Somehow it's gotten to 10 years behind before it's become an issue. And I put that in context with the current issue regarding sale of the Civic Center and the fact that it's suddenly a huge priority. It didn't seem to be as big a priority during the budgeting process that was just completed. But while that budgeting process was going on, arrangements were being made and plans being made to get out of the Civic Center as soon as possible. And it's that sort of split of focus and things like that that I hope this committee will dig into and again ask why, as to why wasn't this the biggest priority raised during the budget season? If it's suddenly that urgent that we get out of here, that we look at that closely. And also look at it closely from the standpoint of rhetoric, I suppose, that the building's described as decrepit, falling apart, that sort of thing. I've been on a tour with staff here in the building, and certainly there's a lot to be done, but no more than you would expect in a 100-plus-year-old building, certainly. Also, to ask into the question as to why it's too decrepit for the city to repair and redo and redesign and allocate space more appropriately, to sell it to a developer then who might do that very same thing. If a developer can rescue it and make a profit out of it, I'm certain that the city can find a way to do that as well too. So anyway, I just hope that you will bring your expertise to bear on this process as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hi, I'm Eric Passett. I'm the owner of North Shore Apartments and Condos, and I'm also a resident of the 4th Ward. And, I wanted to come, I remember Alderman Newsman bringing up the fact about what we can do with the Civic Center, police station, fire department. And my real concern about that I brought up at several city council meetings is, as a landlord in Evanston, as kind of a rather large landlord in Evanston, property taxes in our apartment buildings have gone up dramatically. I know at least one of our buildings went up 20% this year. And it sounds like a lot, but on a $50,000 or $70,000 tax bill, that's quite a bit. And I know my home went up quite a bit, that much also. And if we keep on piling the debt, property taxes are going to continue to go up. And I know the city council is, and the city is saying about affordability in Evanston, it has, our rents have gone up tremendously. And not that we have really benefited as a landlord, like we're making a lot more. Some of our rents have gone up 10 to 15% in the last year. And you think, well, we're benefiting a lot. And mostly we're just not even covering costs. The water bill went up 19%. Now, on a homeowner, that's $20 a month max. On a building, that's huge. Times 20 buildings, it's a lot. And so, I don't exactly know what the answer is. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know what the answer is. All I know is piling on more and more debt is going to stranglehold us. Plus with our district 65 is doing with, building a new school and all that, it's just not going to stop. And, downtown Evanston, compared to other downtown areas, is, I wouldn't say vacant, but very much so struggling. Our business district has not recovered even close to anywhere else. If you go to downtown Wilmette, if you go to a restaurant in downtown Wilmette, you can't, you have to make reservations to go to the restaurants. Not so in Evanston. And I think, it's still largely vacant, comparatively speaking. So, that's all I have to say. So, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more in-person comments? I don't think so. Anyone online?
Yes, this is John Kennedy. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm speaking to you from Maui, so I apologize if there's sounds of luau's in the background. But I wanted to make a comment to this group, Budget and Finance, that they really need to take a look at the debt. And the prior two speakers spoke to this issue. But specifically, if you look at the 5-year CIP projection, buried in there is a fairly well graphic representation of the debt that's going to be added to the city over the next 5 years. And a rough calculation moves our debt from roughly $400 million today to nearly $800 million, or close to $1 trillion. And in that process, you're probably going to be doubling the costs the taxpayers have to put to pay for these things. The GO bonds alone are going up 150% from where they are today. And, this is going to have a major impact on our credit rating, which I would suggest that we reach out to an independent rating service rather than one who might benefit from the sale of these bonds as to what the impact will be. We've already seen that the level of our debt has dropped, our credit rating a point. If we continue in this process, it's going to hurt us even more. And again, piling all this stuff on. Now, the question that you need to provide is, how do we pay for this? Where is this going to, provide? If you ask staff, they don't know. They're throwing a lot of information at the capital improvement budget and expecting the council to turn around and cut things. Yet, it's like Christmas. Everything on the list was approved pretty much totally by the council. And, there has to be some constraints put on this process, or you're going to drive Evanston's credit rating out the door, and you're going to drive residents out the door from an affordability standpoint. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more online comments?
Yes, there are.
Okay. All right. And you, please proceed.
Thank you. I'm Brian Bacharis, and I am a lifetime resident of Evanston. I currently reside in the 9th Ward, and I'm first of all, I want to thank you all for your hard work in the community and for entertaining my opinions and comments. There's a lot of recent news about some of the large projects that are being committed in the community, and I'm very concerned that these are very large and expensive projects, the implications of which have not really been correctly presented to the people who will pay for it, which are the taxpayers and residents of this community. I want to ask you to take a moment to consider recent projects like the Crown Community Center, which was originally proposed at approximately $26 million and kept incrementally being bumped up until it was somewhere around $70 million to complete that project. Now we're being faced with a number of other new projects, including a civic center, a police and fire headquarters, a new school, the renovation repair of and future development for the service center for the municipal vehicles and maintenance, and $100 million capital budget improvements slated for this year. You add that all up, and it's north of $350 million. And to echo Mr. Kennedy's comment, when you look at all this and you roll in the police and fire pension debt, we're looking at over $600 million in debt. That's a lot of money on the backs of people in this community. And I do believe, honestly, that it will change the fabric of our community. As someone who believes in equity and social justice and affordability. And like the gentleman who spoke previously, I own 3 buildings in Evanston, my home and two rental properties next door. And those are all well over 100 years old. One of them is over 140 years old. And I also was with Mr. Borini and Alderman Nguyen and others in the tour of the Civic Center in December. And none of the problems pointed out, the many problems, but were any different than any old building in any community in the Midwest. And I feel strongly about what others have mentioned about the Civic Center. The Civic Center should have been settled business 15 years ago in a referendum where more than 80% of the voters responded, stay in the Civic Center and begin to plan a thoughtful renovation of that building. And none of that happened. And, the people who guided the tour surely highlighted all the foibles and all the current conditions. And, and I honestly believe that much of that is because of deferred maintenance. And now we're told we need to replace it. But I'm in favor of renovating it for serious savings in that situation. And it also it's troubling to hear about the lack of transparency in this whole process, that the community who are paying for it are not being invited to weigh in and not being invited to propose other ideas and share. There's a lot of smart people in Evanston. And now we're told that we need to build a new one downtown or rent a property for some period of time. And that can be avoided by thoughtfully renovating it in stages and moving people around and the like. And I just want to impart upon you my personal belief that this community cannot commit to projects like these on this scale with the same people who allowed this to happen. Our sidewalks are deteriorating, our other buildings are not being maintained as well as they might. I believe that things like this have the potential for being the biggest boondoggle in Evanston history, and it can be avoided.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time, and please tell the alders to give the community a chance to weigh in meaningfully. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other virtual comments? I see Councilmember Burns is online as well. Okay, so thank you, everyone, for their public comments. I think that is a key priority for us this year, is to understand what our capital needs are. And I think everyone would acknowledge that there's been a degree of capital neglect over the last few decades, and we're having to play catch-up, just like we had to do on pensions, and we need to prioritize what we need to do and try to look at it as objectively as possible. So, going on to the approval of the minutes from, it's been a while, November 14th.
Second.
Okay. Any comments? Doesn't sound like it, so we'll go to vote on the approval of the minutes.
Councilmember Kelly. Aye. Committee Member McMillan.
Aye.
Councilmember Nguyen. Councilmember Nusma. Committee Member Rikus.
Aye.
Councilmember Burns. Chair Livingston.
Aye. Okay. Very good, so the minutes are approved. The next item of business is on page 6 of the packet, which is to go over the proposed meeting dates for this year. I think there's a couple points that maybe we should just discuss first, that we don't currently have a August meeting scheduled nor a December meeting scheduled. And last year we discussed in August there was a desire not to have meetings of multiple city committees during August. I think that is unfortunate because our initial budget discussion then happens immediately in September. So maybe we could get Mr. Desai's view on some sort of ability to have a meeting in August, even if it's limited to where we think we are on a targeted list going into the budget of where we are in the current year and what are major input items. I think that would be helpful, even if we keep it to be a very targeted meeting, to have something in August.
Okay, good evening, Happy New Year, the chair, the members of the committee. And this is the kind of, I know we have a few council members here that they ask, particularly the Ellison, who kind of coordinates all the meetings, that, yeah, please, if possible, don't arrange any meetings in the August, so they have the time. I think the second meeting right now, there's no second council meeting, if I'm correct, in August. So we are trying to align with that, that she sends the email to all the people who manage the other committees and all that, and say, yeah. So that way the council members are kind of free during that last couple of weeks of the August. If this committee desires otherwise, we can definitely do that.
We can always schedule it and cancel if it.
Yeah, it's, absolutely, yes. But that's why we kind of, as a staff, recommend to take into consideration, because we have 5 council members on this committee, and that's why we try to kind of go like that.
So I think it's the first half that most of the meetings, we have a city council meeting on the 26th of August. So if we want to keep those first 2 weeks open, I would say maybe we just, for the August, we schedule it maybe on the 27th, at the end of August.
Yeah, I think it would just be helpful, as we saw this year, I view this committee's role as to provide input on the major items that are taken into consideration in the budget, and then things go very fast from that point. It's hard to have, major structural change once in September you have submitted the budget, right? So it would be good, I think, to have a targeted meeting in late August before the budget is really in presentable form for you to bring up, here are my critical issues that we still think we need to discuss and get guidance on. Even if we keep it very targeted, it would give us an opportunity to understand and have input before we actually have a presented budget.
Committee has any consensus last Tuesday, last Thursday, anything like that? Yes?
So I'm looking at the calendar. There's the 20th is a Tuesday. They're only the Housing and Community Development Committee. I don't know if that's at 7, so I think we could all make a 5, in terms of meetings. 5 o'clock on the 20th, or the following Tuesday, the 27th, which is right after the council meeting on Monday. So those are the two dates.
Okay.
I'd say earlier might be better, the 20th?
Either one would work for me. I think sooner rather than later is always a good idea.
I'm maybe out of town, but, okay.
So I think
Yeah.
27th might serve the purpose right after the
20th, I
dozen.
think.
27th?
20th,
I
the 20th.
personally, I would prefer the 27th if we added that in, but I think we could certainly poll ourselves, and I think now decide we want to add something for August and approve that August meeting. See who wants the 20th, who wants the 27th.
I think earlier is better.
Yeah, I would just think if we can do the 20th, because in case there's any recommendations that we're making to council, it's, there's a council meeting the next Monday.
Okay, so why don't we put in the 20th for now, and people can correspond about how many, do we think we're going to have enough people? But it would just be good to say, here are 5 items we still need input on relative to next year's budget, and we try to keep that tight.
We can reassess in July and
Yeah, for
I mean,
sure.
Meetings can always be canceled, I mean, just to be clear. And I would say for December, same thing, this is budget season, so like the 3rd of December, there are no meetings. I think, as the Finance and Budget Committee, we should schedule it, and come November, if we're all wrapped up and everything's, finalized with budget, we can cancel it. But I would recommend putting it on the calendar for the 3rd of December.
The 3rd, so not the 10th.
Oh,
Which would be our normal
that
one.
would be our normal one?
Our normal one would be, I think, the 2nd.
Second Tuesday.
The 2nd. So,
So maybe the
Mr.
3rd.
Desai, if you're okay, why don't we, August 20th, December 10th, knowing that we could end up adjusting and not having those meetings, but as Councilmember Kelly pointed out, if we don't have it on there, it's harder to get it on there, it's easier to take it off. So people could at least understand, and I understand that maybe not everybody can be at the meetings, but
That's fine.
at least we have it structured in. So we would then, I don't know if we need a motion to adjust this, to add in a,
I'll move approval of the calendar as published with the addition of August 27th and December 10th.
Second.
August 20th or 27th?
20th.
20th,
Say,
okay.
Right, 20th.
20th.
Yes, okay.
And I might have a problem with that. And December 10th.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I guess we can second it, and,
Oh, second.
all right. And we go ahead and vote on the.
Okay.
the meeting
Councilmember Kelly,
calendar.
Committee Member McMillan,
Aye.
Councilmember Wynn,
Aye.
Councilmember Nusma.
Aye.
Committee Member Rikus,
Aye.
Councilmember Burns,
Aye.
and Chair Livingston.
Aye. Okay. Very good. Okay, so moving beyond that, our next discussion item is to discuss the current market conditions for the issuance of bonds. As the group knows, it's been several years since we've last had a bond issuance. I think we were able, given our cash reserves, to ride out some of the highest spike in rates, but let's get an update on what bond conditions are now as we think about, because it does seem highly likely we will be doing some bond issuance likely in the first half of this year, but we're still going to need Mr. Desai's
Right, and-
guidance on when we should do it.
And I won't speak much on that, except we have the Anthony Maselli, our financial advisor from the Spear Financial. So I would just give it to him. He has 2 slides, kind of one is the numbers and the other one is the overall market update. Anthony, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
I appreciate it. Okay, I can try to share. Oh, you have it there. Perfect. Great. Good evening, everybody. I'll just give a quick kind of overview of the market, and I do have some updated numbers for the city that we can talk through and kind of talk about how those have changed since we last spoke and since we really initially spoke about the financing. Looking at the first slide there, the year in review, as was mentioned, we saw really the highest period of municipal interest rates, and interest rates market-wide in quite a while last year. Rates kind of maintained a high level and steadily increased through about October of 2023. This is on the heels of Fed's battle against inflation, which resulted in 11 rate hikes between the first quarter of 22 and July of 2023, ending with a Fed funds target of between 5.25% and 5.5%. So that lasted until about mid to the end of October, and then in November, we saw a pretty dramatic decrease in interest rates as there was some, good data on inflation, ideally being tamed. The market belief that the Fed really reached the end of this tightening cycle. So with that, we saw a pretty dramatic increase in municipal rates and rates, market wide. So if you look at the next slide there, so this is just an expanded view of the same thing. So what we're looking at, and I should have opened with this on the last slide, but what we're looking at is the AAA MMD index. And what that is that's the index that municipal bonds are priced off of. So it's a representation of where a pure AAA issuer would trade. So this is an expanded version looking all the way back to 2016 with just a few data points put in terms of kind of market events that had happened. But you can see from the beginning of 22, when the Fed began its rate increases, the sharp increase in interest rates that we saw that really sustained all the way through 23. In the end of the third quarter, fourth quarter 23, inflation looked to be persistent while economic growth continued and rates continued to increase, as mentioned on the previous slide. And then you see that sharp drop off right at the end as the the belief is that inflation had been controlled and the Fed was done with that increase, or the tightening cycle rather. So we look at the next slide. I'll wait till you get there. This is the 10-year Treasury. A lot of the same data points as the municipal market really does track the Treasury market most of the time, I would say. But we had a 10-year Treasury rate that really hovered near 4% for most of 2023, right until about October, when we almost hit 5%. I think it did close at about 4.99, and then in November dropped about 100 basis points. So really dramatic increase, or decrease rather, in just a short amount of time. So if you look at the next slide, so this is the anticipated financing that we had begun talking about in 2022. So it's a $15 million capital borrowing issued over 20 years, and it's the same basic structure that I had been updating since that time. But if we look at rates as of today, you're looking at an all-in debt service, or all-in a true interest cost, so representation of the average rate plus all costs to complete the financing, at just over 3.87%. That's the estimate as of today. If we look historically at where we've been when I've updated this, when we looked in September of 22, we were at a 3.92% all-in TIC. October of 2022, that increased to a 4.31%. And the last update was in January of 23, when we saw a little bit of a rally in the market before rates began to increase again in 23, but that went down to a 3.58. So it's a really quick snapshot of the market and the numbers for a $15 million 20-year financing. I did provide some more detailed numbers, but I think the summary I just shared kind of encapsulate what those are. So happy to answer any questions, or if there's anything I want to quickly over, please.
Sure. Ms. Ruckus.
What is the callable on these bonds? Do we say like they're callable in 3 years, or in case interest rates go down?
Yeah, so it's the typical call provision is 10 years. That said, we've been selling bonds between 8 to 10 years with a call. I believe if you pull up that numbers packet, you can see what I've assumed for the call date. And it's too small for me to read, but it should be listed up. There we go. So I've got 2033 at par.
So 10-year call?
Yep.
And have you
that
seen
could be
bonds that are
adjusted. That's actually
substantially less than that? I think I've seen some that are more like a 5 or 3 or 5 year call, or are those outliers in the market?
That would be an outlier. So this is a provision that we get to set at the time of issuance, and the shorter we set that call provision, if it's kind of an outlier in the market, it's something we may be paying for, and that's something we can look at when the time comes to issue the bonds. When we say, hey, what does it cost for a 7-year call versus a 8-year or 9-year call, and is that flexibility that the city wants to pay for right now?
And just a
5-year
follow-up,
call
is if
short.
we were to do larger amounts, like a 20 million to cover a few years, is it economies of scale, do you get a lower rate, or is not really?
No, not really. No. There is some of that, but it's more dramatic. So going from 15 to 20 doesn't necessarily change the rate you're going to get. You will get some economies of scale on the cost of issuance, but it's where you see really large benefit from increasing deal sizes going to, the kind of dramatic, like $80, $100 million deals, where they get a lot of liquidity from large investors in that point.
So are you seeing municipalities come back to the market now? What does issuance activity look like? How deep is the new issuance market?
Yeah, good question. I mean, it's obviously we're only 9 days into the year, but so far things look like they're picking up. 2023 was a really low year for municipal issuance, I think for a number of reasons. Interest rates were certainly one of those reasons. You've got a lot of municipalities that had just come off a few years of increased revenues, ARPA monies and other federal stimulus, and didn't necessarily have the need to borrow, coupled with high interest rates. Coming off a very low interest rate environment where, a lot of people did get some projects done at that point. So last year it was a very slow year in the municipal bond market in terms of issuance. This year, without any, specific data to back it up, because we just kind of started, but I am seeing many more issues coming to market already this month, frankly. So it'll be good to see these deals get into the market and see how the market starts to accept them.
Councilmember Kelly? I think your light's on. Okay, no problem. Right, so what would be your advice to Evanston now in terms of thinking about a likely timing for issuance?
Sure. Well, it'll be interesting to see how January kind of concludes here in terms of interest rates. I would really focus your borrowing timing on your need for the funds, while keeping in mind that we also do have a presidential election coming up in November. So as we kind of delay things too long, we have certainly seen how that's created some chaos in the market. Not knowing what's going to happen, but it's kind of a big uncertainty that lies out there. But end of October was a tough time, and I'm glad we're off that peak. And if that continues, hopefully we find a good time for people to get in the market next few months, or at least over the summer.
So to the degree we have a pressing need for additional funds in '24, it sounds like maybe the March to May window is something you would think we should consider. Still stay away from the election, but.
I agree. I think, as long as there's a need for funds, I wouldn't, I generally don't recommend trying to time the market and get funds before you need them. Project costs change, timing changes, avoid sitting on bond proceeds that you don't need. But, if there's shovel-ready projects and you have dollars that you need deployed, then yeah, getting out, sometime in the spring or summer ahead of the election.
Does anyone else have any questions? I think that was helpful to know. It appears to be a constructive market. We'll learn more over the next several weeks as to how issuances are going. Rates have fallen from where they were. It all comes down to, the real need that we have and the available to move liquidity around.
I mean, I would just add, and I think Anthony, he has mentioned some of the numbers in his presentation. You see the numbers here, and what he's talking about, the all-inclusive cost, the interest rate of 3.87 he mentioned. I just looked at the past, like in 2020, right after COVID, we issued the bonds. The rate was around 2.5. In 21, it was the best rate, 1.66, a year after COVID, I think, So to put it in perspective, so obviously, as he said, and as you guys feel, this committee feels that, I guess, we should wait and see few more months. Let's see how the inflation's trending, and if it's in the right direction, we might see a little break in these rates, and even we could say maybe, I don't know, 50 to 75 basis points in the next 3 months is too aggressive, Anthony?
I don't know that my crystal ball is that clear. It's actually, I hope so. Frankly, if we can keep trending in the correct direction, I'll tell you, the news is all over the board in terms of what people are predicting. We're going to have this soft landing, or are they going to start cutting in March, or is there, some are even saying that there might be, inflation will come out higher and they'll need another increase. It's really all over the board, so it's really hard to predict. But again, we'll kind of see how January, February, come in and be able to move. I'll say, yes, when you look at the recent history going back to 2020, 2021, and if that's your focus on financing costs, it's a tough one because that was all-time lows.
I'm not looking for that 1.66,
Yeah. But if you expand that window and, we're probably, closer to the 2006, 2007 range as of last year. And maybe we're, if you were to borrow in 2009, this is about what we're getting now. So it's not as we're not in the 1980s yet, but let's hope we never do that again in terms of, 13% rates. But, if you expand that window, we're really not too far out of, historical averages, but, nice to see it under 4% again, that's for sure.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony.
Member Rikus?
I have two quick questions.
Yeah.
What do we have rolling off this year, and what rates are those at?
It would be around 10 million. I don't know exactly the coupons for those things,
It's got to be more than three. Yeah.
Right.
And then I know this is unorthodox, but if we are a little early, we are getting 5% on, we would be able to make money. It's almost like an arbitrage.
We would have made the money. If you think the January rate is short in 23 or at around 3.5, and I think I've been getting the rate started going up in, I think, the March of 22. So we were at the peak, I think, in 23 after almost a year. We would have made maybe 50 basis points. I don't know. It could have resulted in arbitrage per issue for me,
Yeah.
But
well, anyway, I think it would be helpful for a group to know what's rolling off.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I do have that chart, and I'll share it with you all. And I think in '24, it's 12.1 million, I believe, is rolling off. Next year, 12.6. So up until about 28, between last year and 28, I think it's a total of about 81.
In the last 2 years when we didn't issue bonds, we had rolling off too, right?
Right. So
it
this
averages
should be this
around-
goal, right, to reduce our debt. We do have a very high debt, so at some point, I hope we will agree to develop a recommended debt policy, what we'd like to see ideally annually in terms of reducing our debt, sort of ideally, and sort of a minimum and maximum. So I'll share that chart with you.
So, Mr. Desai, you're really going to need to present to us, and I think we should in the next meeting, given your cash flow projections, when do you believe it is a need that we generate additional liquidity through a bond issuance?
Here's the one thing which I continue to bring it up to this committee and to the council. We have money when you see in one pot. can I use it? Yes, if I start taking from here, the TIF money, this money, and put it, CIP is already a negative, you know? Yes, council has approved and continue to approve the projects for 22, 23, and now 24. So, and obviously the department, whether it's the Public Works, Parks, Recreation, Water Department, they continue to work on that, bid out the projects, and then we start paying for that as the work gets, towards the completion. We draw down on our CIP fund balance. I mean, again, it was earmarked for some others. So it is a time, if I just look at my CIP fund balance and where do I stand, it's just a matter of time before IDOT bills us for $7, $8, $10 million, I think, $7 to $10 million. And we won't have the cash either. But as I said, again, that being said, I don't say that, yes, I need to issue the bond or start working on it next month, right? As I think I told a few times, that looks like, we can wait maybe until March, April, So I think I can come back to you. I'll ask Anthony to run some numbers maybe after a couple of months, and come back to you in March and see this is where the market is, if it looks good, and we can ask for your direction.
I'm a little confused. So are you going to be showing us the need for the bonds, or you're just going to show us, what is the ask?
Yes, I will show. Like right now what happens is in CIP fund, for example, the work is done, but IDOT hasn't billed us. So our fund balance is already negative by under the accounting rule. But we have the cash because we haven't paid that. Now if the next month, say we get the invoices from IDOT, then I have to come to you and say, okay, where would I find the cash? Yes, we just renewed that, line of credit. Right. So it's not that, okay, I won't have the cash. I would have the cash. But I have to tell you the facts that, okay, this is what happened. Now the CIP has a negative cash balance. The rate market is here after 2 months. And what should I do? I have already drawn the line of credit for a couple of millions. And
You've never drawn on the line, though, to date, have you?
no.
And what's the current rate on that line?
I mean, it is indexed to, but it would be higher than that. I mean, it's definitely higher than what they give us, on our deposits. So obviously, when they are giving above 5%, it's higher than that.
Yeah, it's not a tax-free
No.
borrowing, right? So it's above the 5.
Right.
So it's probably 6, right? So I think that's what we need in our next meeting is more specifics from you of what's the amount, why is it the amount, and what is your recommendation? Or how do we think about, do we go in March, do we go in April, and why? And what's driving the size and the timing is really what we need to have an open discussion about.
I mean, I can, financial more, I would like to work a little bit on the Lara Biggs and others, whether any payments are in the pipeline, whether sometimes they know that, okay, but we can come to this committee.
How long do you have after IDOT invoices you to pay?
It's generally 30 days, and it's not that they will charge us any late fees, I guess, but they're already late by almost a year, 2, 3 years. Sometimes they bill us for after 5 years. So, but typically it's at 30 days.
Well, we might as well use their balance sheet as long as we can.
Yes.
And also, when you give us the projection, because there's short-term needs, because we have receivables, and then there's long-term projections, can you make sure we get that separated so we know we don't panic and just say we need a bond because of short-term needs?
Yeah, and to your point, Sherry, I mean, yes, the arbitrage is nice, but that makes me uncomfortable just because you're not match funding, and, it's a slippery slope.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look good. As you said, it is a good thing to have it, but there's other side too. Yeah.
Yes, but let's not rely on that.
This was very helpful, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anthony.
Okay.
And again, just to dovetail on what David said, if we can get like all the IDOT too, I know generally when we enter into contracts, we have a funding source, and it sounds like we're never quite sure, we're going to suddenly have to come up with money for IDOT. So if we could get, as David said, the need, what we have a need to, and what IDOT outstanding, IDOT, payments we're expecting, I think that would be really helpful. Thank you.
So one of the big items for this year is to try to understand our capital needs more and how that manifests itself into additional borrowing. So all that really comes together. What are the capital needs? Why are we driving specific amounts of bond issuance. And there's some big projects, and I fully agree, we need to understand why. We need to understand what the alternatives are for civic center, police, and fire, but also just the normal recurring CIP. So how do we get our arms around, are we acting strategically, and why did some of these needs, come up as quickly as they have? But I think there's a general belief that we need to validate that there has been a rundown of the infrastructure in the community over the last several decades, and some of those bills are now coming due. So it's unfortunate, and we're just going to have to project. It might be a good goal to reduce debt over time, but if we are facing a couple $100 million of deferred capital between water department, between civic center, police, and fire, how does all of that work into a manageable debt forecast? And what's that mean for our long-term projections? So really need to pull all that together. I think it's clear what we need to do short-term on the bonds, because we talked about the water projects that need to happen, and we have the deficit in CIP. So moving forward with a $15-20 million issuance in the next several months is not a substitute for continuing to do the hard work to understand the scope of our capital needs and what that means in terms of bond issuance over the next 5 years or so. So that's all hopefully something we can make significant progress on this year. So anything else on the discussion of bonds this time? Okay. All right, so another area that would be great to make significant progress on this year is better benchmarking of Evanston versus sort of comparable peer communities. And that's sort of, before we start drawing data together, let's talk about what the right peer communities are and what the criteria should be. And certainly we can expand the list of peers over time, but let's put some initial thought in who should we start gathering data on. We have to decide what that data is, but what are the right communities that Evanston should be benchmarking itself off of?
And for this item, Mike Van Dorp, our financial analyst, has started to do some very high-level preliminary work on this, and he can give an overview of staff's thoughts and what we're hoping to get from this committee to help us move that forward.
Good evening, everybody. Mike Van Dorp, financial analyst. I've been around a few months now with finance since the summer, but been with Evanston for about 3 years now. So, and indeed, for our initial thoughts of how to help narrow down a short list was two simple demographic or ideas: was a parameter on population and a parameter on geography as a way to narrow down a short list. So that was in the memo that was provided. So we would love to get your thoughts on what should be those primary factors to help whittle down a short list. What is a target number of comparable communities that we want to start with? Staff is recommending 7 to 10 communities, and would love to get your thoughts on that. And then what other additional criteria you all feel would be helpful for establishing that list of 7 to 10 or whatever number you all decide is appropriate. Thank you.
And would you like us to just email you what we think would be good communities to compare with?
So I think we would love to have a discussion tonight
Okay.
on what are your thoughts on that. So again, specifically in the memo, we recommended that we should look at communities that are within 50% of Evanston's population. So that's, ballpark 78,000. So plus or minus, that gets you to, just under 39,000 to 116,000. Is that 50% parameter sound reasonable? Or should it be smaller? Should it be larger? We also suggested within 20 miles of Evanston, is that as a way to consider them. And again, maybe there are other communities further than that we do want to consider as well, but
I think
that was just a starting point.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Did you come up with a preliminary list?
He's just doing criteria.
Yeah, criteria at the
Criteria,
moment.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably 100 communities within 20 miles of Evanston. Yeah, I don't know what that exact number
But I
would
would
be,
say,
but
yeah, moving in on proximity, geographical location, proximity, and as well as those that meet that most closely. So for example, Skokie obviously is very close in population and right next door. So that's an obvious one that should always be tops when we're, in our comparables. And I think Wilmette as well. But yeah, I would say as much as we can narrow it down to those that meet those two pieces the most closely.
I had just a couple thoughts because I was reading this. Sometimes we can learn a lot from communities that aren't as close, and maybe communities that have college campuses like we have Northwestern, and maybe adding one or two of those communities, because maybe we can learn how they're dealing with that, because a lot of our tax base. Also, the economic density, Skokie has Westfield Mall and other things, and I don't know if there's some criteria we can look at, where we don't have as much of the businesses, and also looking at the income makeup of our residents, not just the population numbers, because I think there's other challenges with that, so.
So on that point, I think some of those are just the reasons why we might have differences, right? We're not looking to minimize differences. We're just, what are the right peer communities? And then we might look at, well, why do we have more employees? Why, or whatever it might be. I guess the 20 miles, that seems, tight to me. Maybe, something broader like Cook County. But you brought up earlier also maybe Peoria. I don't know, So I think part of it would be Oak Park. Might fall within 20. So I think the population seems about right. 40 to 110,000 probably seems about right. But I guess the geographic limitation of 20 miles, I would at least look at Cook County.
I think we should include Lake County, too. I'd love to see Naperville included. I think it's a really well-run city.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Also looking at, and I can do a survey, I'm vice chair of the Finance and Administrative Committee of the National League of Cities. I can ask for even some surveys of cities that really stand out from doing really stellar running top-notch budgets. I think that's really important too, not to just simply compare, but also compare to cities that are doing really outstanding work with budgeting.
Best practices.
Well, another critical issue in terms of comparison is, as you said in the memo, all of the different districts that in other communities are not part of the city municipality budget, like Parks and Rec, Library, Township Services, and Health Department. So I think that those need to be included in order for us to have an accurate comparison.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, and that's part of our comparison. Part of our benchmarking would be, do they have a separate part?
Yeah.
What's the consolidated tax load? All those things would hopefully be part of a targeted list of items that we're trying to benchmark ourselves off other cities.
I'll be the last to weigh in here, so I probably won't say anything new, but I want to make sure our immediate neighbors are included. Chicago is an immediate neighbor. I'm not sure how relevant of a comparison is to Chicago. It does come up from time to time, well, what's Chicago doing? So it's something to keep in mind. But they are the horse of a different racetrack, as my grandfather used to say. I want to make sure Oak Park is on the list because we are frequently compared to them. If we're looking at geography, I think Cook County kind of makes sense rather than just a strict 20 miles. I'm more interested in Cook County than other communities outside of Cook County. Having said that, Champaign and Bloomington might be interesting comparisons as university towns, and they're in the same general ballpark in terms of population.
I just want to say,
Like Naperville, too.
and I agree, it should be apples to apples, depending on what we're looking at. So for example, if we're looking at expenditures per capita, we want to make sure we're including Parks and Rec, but there's other just practices also that we can look to, any surrounding community, including Wilmette that's smaller, which I hope that we can, I've been doing some research on policies around like the allowable the levy, what do you call it, allowable loss for levy, and, finding out that most communities don't add as much as we do onto our levy for the allowable loss. And, and so I think there's some policies we can survey. We don't have to wait to collect data from a gazillion to know that there are some policies we could move forward with based on just a smattering of nearby communities that are better serving the fiscal interests of their residents.
Yeah, but I think for the purposes of a consistent benchmarking comparison, Evanston to other communities, it really does make sense to have a list and use that list for consistency. If we're looking at best practices, we don't have to be limited to that list.
Certainly, part of this is getting a place to start, right? And certainly what we're going to want to benchmark will grow over time. A lot of it's static, right? Once we've done it, we're going to roughly understand it. We don't have to update everything all the time. But it'd be great to get your views, Mike, on, in light of this feedback, what 10 would you start on? And then why don't we start getting some data on those 10? And we can take the 10 to 20 at some point. But what do we want to start collecting? What are the initial communities? And maybe we do end up with a set of 20 communities, at some point in time. But let's get going with a process and a data set that we can then adjust as we go forward. Sherry?
Just a quick question, Claire, because you're on that other committee. In my industry, this is done every year for banks, for financial. So I don't know. I just want to make sure we're not reinventing the wheel if there's other studies
That's a
that we could be.
great question, because right now that is an initiative that the National League of Cities is taking up, the Finance and Administration Committee, to develop a database where cities can go in and just plug in your numbers. So that's in the works. They've done some of that around the ARPA funding, expenditures just focused on that, but we're actually, I've been working with the staff there, so hopefully that'll be launched within a year or two. So we'll have a database where you can just, plug it in to see how much you spend on your Parks and Rec and compare it to other cities of similar size. And so we are a little bit, so I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah, I'm thinking there's got to be all these resources. We want to make sure we are aware of them all.
I'd love the opportunity to chime in on that too. So my prior employer, there's been a number of consortiums kind of pop up throughout the region over the last 10 years that have focused on performance measurement, and they start and they go for a couple years and they get some good kind of structure in place, and then that data becomes static, and then you look back at it 5 years later and it hasn't been updated, it hasn't been refreshed. So I know that there was a consortium of communities probably 5 years ago that developed something like this in our region. The ICMA and the ILCMA have done performance measure initiatives over time, and they seem good and well-intended, and then things like COVID hit and some of those kind of projects kind of go on a back shelf. So it's nice to hear NLC taking this up too, and maybe that's the most recent initiative that we can kind of look at, and hopefully it carries that longevity, because it's always been one of those things over the last 10 years of performance measurement in local government where it starts, it looks great, and then it goes on a shelf. So there's nothing that I can point to right now in our region that is really good off-the-shelf benchmark data that we can quickly plug and play with.
But this would be critical to, there were some comments earlier that, our debt is high. Well, let's get our data together and really validate, is our debt high relative to whatever benchmark we want to select. So it would help take some of the, it would give us an additional degree of specificity that there is an issue, there is not an issue. It just becomes factual, not a matter of opinion. So why don't, Mike, if you could just take this, and again, I think we can do it in two stages. What's an initial set of communities, not to say that does not grow, and we're going to want it to grow. But what are the initial communities based on the input that you would recommend that we, and we can talk about those in the next meeting, and then also start thinking about what data do we want to start collecting. But ideally, we could have a 1 or 2 page summary that compares, different communities to Evanston, and this is how Oak Park looks, and this is their employee level, this is their debt level, this is their average property tax level. However, that can be a complicated thing.
Right.
And we really take some of the speculation out of it, and it's just more factual and.
I agree. I also don't want to see us get too bogged down in creating this huge survey. I think we can right now, like I have done I have looked at local deficits to see that we really are at the top in terms of per capita deficit. I know when it was just presented our GO bond debt, and we didn't also include in there our public safety pension liability, which is part of the debt. So when Skokie does it, it presents the whole debt, including its IEPA loans and everything else all together as one debt and per capita, and we really are, close to, double that. And so I just think we should start making improvements without waiting for this whole massive program of 20 cities that we're comparing with. I think we can start to move forward with, I think that it's really great to do that, but I don't think we have to have this whole enormous program of 20
It'll be
cities. Like,
something
even with
that improves over time.
Right.
Yeah, and
that we do.
I would, to Claire's point, also look at aspirational cities that are doing things really well, that are, best in class. Let's not make the curve come down. Let's make sure we're comparing ourselves to where we want to be.
We know who those communities are.
Skokie and Naperville would be the two that I would note are, just having spent a lot of time looking at their financials, I would say are terrific. Wilmette does a really nice job as well, if you're looking at their budget. So those would be three that are kind of top of mind. I'm not real familiar with Champaign or Bloomington, though. I haven't looked at theirs.
Thank you.
So for our next meeting, let's think about what those initial communities are and maybe some ideas on what we're going to start collecting. I would find it helpful if we actually posted those communities' audited financial statements on our site, so they're easy to, however we could each very quickly get to what those communities are. So let's think about how we start sharing data, what the communities are, and what targeted data we want to start benchmarking ourselves on.
So on that note, I would love if we could add a few items so that we can make progress and with improvements to our budget and saving taxpayer money for our next meeting. I'd like to ask that we do put the allowable loss factor as an item for discussion. I have done some comparisons with other communities. I think we are overcharging residents. We could save about $1 million in that. I compared, for example, Wilmette only, well, I can go on about it at our next meeting, but we are really at the top. We're really kind of maxing out what we're allowed to add that additional amount onto our levy. And I've compared with Skokie and Wilmette and a couple of other, and we're really, way above what they charge and way above where our losses are coming in. So I would ask that we look at a policy on that next time and compare it, and I can bring those numbers in. I'd also like to have us look at a policy around we talked about the credit card fees. I did check in with some other cities, and other cities do absorb the cost, but for example, Skokie doesn't budget for it. So we budgeted $850,000 next year for credit card fees. That's a huge amount. And like I say, Skokie doesn't budget for it. It just figures it'll pay for it with the revenue that's generated from it. And they sent me their numbers. They pay about $200,000 in credit card fees. So they aren't 4 times smaller than us. So I just think we need to look at that policy too. So I'd like us, just those 2 items at least. Those are some items that came up during the budget season. While it's fresh, I'd like us to address that and see if we can recommend a policy on those 2 items. Also debt. Sure. Yep.
Skokie is not 4 times smaller than us, but they have a separate park district. And a lot of our credit card fees that we're, realizing under the city of Evanston's umbrella are from our Parks and Rec department, I would have to imagine.
Mostly parking. It's like
Right.
parking fees.
So this is where we have to be mindful of how the differences
Sure.
between Evanston and other communities.
Right. No, it's just a little over 200 altogether with parks, health, and everything. So apples to apples. But I think we should look at it. Like, again, they don't, that's a lot, $850,000 for credit card fees to be budgeting for 2024. So.
Okay. So all good ideas that benchmarking will help with. What are things that appear odd that maybe we're sub-managing? why is there a difference, and how do we, if we can't understand why there is a difference, maybe we're not managing it as well as we should. So we'll,
And debt policy. So if we could just, I think we should start moving forward with looking at some items that will serve our residents. So debt policy, the allowable loss factor, credit card fees.
So debt policy, I think, is a function of what's going to have to come out of some of the capital needs work. Because it's going to be difficult to say, look, we want debt to come down by X per year when we don't understand what our capital needs are yet.
So I think you can. I'll share some debt policy from other cities also, so you can see what cities do to, at least to reflect a goal of not issuing excessive debt. For example, I think the gentleman that spoke to us today said you don't want to issue debt when you don't need it immediately. I mean, there's just some basic policies that you can have on the books to avoid unnecessary debt. And I think that those are the kind of policies we should look at establishing.
Okay. Anything else on the, does that help?
Thank you. Yep.
Okay.
Helpful.
Thank you. All right, so our next item is to go over where we think we ended on the final, well, we did end on the final budget, but also 23.
So thank you, Chair. Books are not closed on 23. We do have 3 more months of revenues to receive and more bills to potentially be paid, and as well as several adjustments that are made as part of the annual audit process. But we've refreshed our projections and are here today to share those with you. At the end of the day, they're not too terribly different from what we shared in August, whenever we provided a mid-year update. Since August, really the biggest change was the Finance and Budget Committee and the City Council approved a $4.9 million transfer from general fund reserves to the insurance and fleet funds. So that was really the biggest thing in terms of what moved our projections at all. So I'll walk through these slides now. If you look at this slide here, this slide shows our actual year-to-date through the end of November, November 23, compared to our year-to-date in the general fund through the end of 22. You can see that at this point in 2022, we were up $19.9 million in the general fund on our way to the $26 million surplus that was generated. In 2023, we sit with a deficit of $11.1 million net operating deficit in the general fund. That's a $30 million swing in operating expenses and revenues in 1 year. You can see that a majority of that is salaries and benefits. You can see those are up about $10 million from 22 to 2023. Most of that are the wage increases, hiring positions that has occurred in 23 that hadn't in 22. If you look in the insurances and chargebacks, you can see that's up by $7 million. $5 million of that was the initial payment that we made in January from general fund reserves for the public safety pensions. The amount needed to cover those 100% in 2023. And if you look at revenues, you can see other taxes down by about $4 million. $2 million of that is going to be $3 million of that is going to be the real estate transfer tax that in 2022 was fully deposited in the general fund. In 23, the first $3 million this year was deposited in the real estate transfer, or in the reparations fund. So you can see those are kind of the three big things contributing to this $30 million swing in our net operating surplus. And the property tax, we've actually recorded more in November than we did in November of 2022. So at this point in the year, you can kind of discredit that. We've received essentially all of our property taxes here on January 8th. We've received our full, almost, I think, our full 2023 amount. This is just through the end of November.
So are you still projecting about 11 million deficit once everything's in December?
Next couple slides. I'll walk through what that is. So I just wanted to give that snapshot of this is real data. This isn't projections. This isn't anything other than actual year-to-date data through the end of November. So then on the next couple slides, we kind of project, okay, well, what's left in revenues, what's left in expenses through the end of the year, and where do we think that the year will land? So in terms of revenues, we provided a low and a high projection back in August. We felt at that time that revenues would finish $13.3 million over budget. At this point, we've taken another look at that, and we're right around $15.1 million over budget. So A couple things contributing to that. One is the state income tax. That really picked up starting in July of this year, and it's proved that the state's budget has given us a higher percentage of our allocation for the LGDF, the Local Government Distributive Fund, for state income taxes. So that's one area where we've gone up. If you look at ticket fines and parking, that's at $3.5 million through the end of '23 against our projection of $3.1 million. So we brought in more than we anticipated there. And then a couple other ones that we were a little low on. There were a couple that we overshot. One of those is building permits. We did not get sort of that end of the year big project in building permits that we needed in order to keep this revenue on pace with 2022 actuals. That's sitting at $4.3 million right now. A lot of that gets backed out as part of the audit or as part of the year-end process. Some revenues get deposited in that account and then we back them out. So we expect to finish right around there at $4.3 million for building permits. So you can see our projections from last August, September on revenues, not too terribly different at this point, maybe a 1.7 million increase.
What is our real estate transfer tax? Because this isn't clearly, we collected more than this, and I know it goes straight to reparations, but it's a little bit.
So this is general fund only because we're talking general fund and the health of the general fund.
Right.
If you look in the actual column there, it shows $310,000 for the general fund, which means we brought in $3,310,770.
Okay, so
in
that's
total real
plus
estate
3
transfer
million.
taxes.
And I thought we were weren't we transferring just for property over a certain amount? I thought for like 1.5 million. I mean, wasn't that?
In practice,
the
and I know we
ordinance?
talked about this during the budget process, that perhaps that, I thought you brought this up during the
I
budget
did. I just wanted some
process.
clarity because I had some residents ask, because I know that was the ordinance for property over a certain value, but it looks like we're just transferring it all, right?
In practice, it's worked out that the first 3 million, regardless of the property value,
value.
has been deposited in the reparations
So we
fund.
should we should amend that ordinance. I'd be happy to amend it, but I think the ordinance does read for property over 1.5 million. So
Understood.
that should be,
Not that, yeah. I mean, and I think you're right, yeah, what Clayton said, that the ordinance clearly says the real estate transfer tax. It doesn't talk about the value of the
no,
property.
okay, I'll see if I can pull it up.
Clayton, can I bring up one more thing? I talked to Luke too, but there was an excess PPRT. Is that related to this at all?
Excess PPRT. Saw your note on that.
Yeah, from, Jack mentioned it from the PPRT, and I just don't know where that goes.
I mean, it does go into general fund, but if he's talking about, these are the financials as of November.
Okay,
And obviously, we have mentioned a few times that compared to '22, there's an estimate of what, 28 or 36% reduction? 29% reduction in PPRD. But those payments we get 8 times a year, and those are sometimes uneven, depending on how much they collect from the corporate income tax and others. So, yeah, unless he's talking about, say, most recent payment even in January, I don't know whether, or December, late December payment. We can check
Okay.
that, yeah.
And one issue with the PPRT is it's on the state calendar year, which is June 30, so it's never going to match up
Right, yeah.
exactly with ours, but, so.
But we do have a surplus, I mean, we ran a surplus as to what we projected in our policies that we would apply 100% of it. So that surplus that we got on the PPRT, that will go towards pensions, correct?
So I don't think that's the way the policy works. I mean, the policy is we owe them the actuarially determined contribution to get to 100%, and that's funded by flat property taxes, the PPRT with the net coming out of the general fund. So if there is a higher than budgeted amount on PPRT, I think that helps the general fund. I don't think we owe them a
I think it
contribution
helps the
above and
taxpayers.
beyond.
I think it helps the taxpayers by reducing the levy. I think that's what we said. We can go back to our policy, but I think we were very clear that 100% of PPRT we would allocate, and the difference would be in the property tax.
No, the difference
So-
is the general fund.
The
Well,
property.
the general fund.
I mean,
but-
and we can bring up
Of
the
course,
po-
it comes from the general fund. When you levy, it goes into the general fund. But I'm talking in terms of how we benefit the taxpayer. And I think our discussion was just begin allocating 100% of the PPRT towards because that is one of its main purposes is to fund public safety debt liability. So
So we can go back through the policy, but it certainly was, look, above the property taxes, to get to the actuarially determined calculation, there's two sources. There's the PPRT, and the net comes out of the general fund. And if there's no
Understood.
room in the general fund, that's the only instance where you would then increase the property tax.
Right.
So now we have enough room between the general fund, because of their excess reserves in the general fund, and PPRT. So I think it's pretty clear that if there's excess PPRT, that benefits the general fund. It does not benefit, it does not result in an incrementally
Good. When
higher
email I
contribution.
got from Jack, he said we can use that as part of the payment, which means less will have to come out of the general fund.
correct. We use it.
And I
all
think we
towards
had this discussion a couple of times, and even I think I mentioned this at the council. First thing is, and again, I would like reiterate my thing, there is no state rule which says that 100% of PPRT should go to the pension funds. You know, I mean, we have the Department of Commerce and Economic, we have brought it up. Second thing is, the policy says, as Chair mentioned, that yes, they get their 100% contribution. Whatever the actual valuation we get, we give that number. Where does that contribution come from? First thing is of keeping the levy flat for the police. Second thing is any one of following, and which includes general fund reserve, PPRT, and like those. So ultimately, but yes, we get more in PPRT, it goes to the general fund balance. And that might help us, you know, take
It's
the
supposed to
money.
be used, so our policy says it's the maximum allowable PPRT allocation goes to the pensions.
Right,
The
but what is
maximum
that?
allowable amount
Is
is
what?
100%.
No, that's, I mean, allowable means, is it part of general fund?
Legal, the amount that's allowable would be the amount that we can legally apply, and that's 100%.
Right, but it's same thing, but we cannot go beyond the actual valuation. You know?
Understood.
Right, that's the basic thing, because otherwise, yes, we could say, yeah, right now we have said 200 million liability, where would I find $200 million? Yes, take up the whole reserves.
It's all good news. It helps the tax levy, and it'll get funded 100%.
And I think the purpose of the committee was, and particularly you raised the thing that, okay, we don't want any more increase to the police and fire pension tax levy. So we said, okay, we'll keep that at flat, and then we will find other resources somewhere else, general fund reserves, PPRT. But again, I mean, I checked it, and I don't know whether you have the thing, I can share that Department of Commerce thing, where it says how the PPRT should be shared.
Right.
It doesn't say public safety pension only. It talks about Social Security, it
That's
talks
the
about
first, though.
IMRF, it talks about some of the other things too. So, and in the past, I see my numbers. When I started first in Evanston in 2001, we used to give around 4.79% of the PPRT to the police pension and fire pension based on some calculation done way back or some of the finance directors in 80s and 90s. So it is subject to the debate, yes. Ultimately, we have to stay to the kind of our intention, you know, that, okay, we want to contribute without raising any tax levy. So that's the whole thing about, yeah.
And it certainly delays any future increase in the property tax levy for the pensions. It provides additional reserves in the general fund because PPRT was favorable, just like any other revenue source would be favorable. It's good news, but we've made our contribution. It's just a function of how we're funding that contribution.
Also, worth noting, this is a discussion on 2023 projections too. So in 2023, the entire difference was funded with a transfer from general fund reserves. Our policy didn't apply to how we fully funded pensions in 23. That was incorporated and addressed as part of our 2024 budget. So these are just our projections for 2023. And you can see we think that we'll finish about 1.7 better than we told you in August on revenues alone. In terms of expenses, you've seen this list many times. We've only added 2 items to it. These are items that were approved by the City Council in 2023 that were not included in the 2023 budget. You can see use of fund balance. Fortunately, with 15 million in additional revenues over budget, we don't really necessarily need to worry too much about the deficit that was budgeted in 23. That's generally covered by those additional revenues. If you look through, we transferred more than $3 million to projects, capital projects that came in over budget. Also approved higher than budgeted wage increases totaling about $5 million over what we had budgeted, and then approved these transfers to the insurance and fleet fund in November in order to correct fund balance issues within those 2 funds. So if you look at this, this shows the current projection for the general fund. As I said, by the end of November, we were sitting down 11 million, subject to many changes, subject to all the revisions through the audit process, subject to our last 3 months of revenues coming in on trend, and bills being paid that at least the finance department is aware of. Our projection in August was that we would finish with a deficit of 5.4 million, figuring in those additional reserves, figuring in updated expense projections and updated revenue projections. We go from a $5.5 million deficit to the $8.7 million deficit here that you see here.
Clayton, I want to make sure we understand this. So our projection was 5.5.
Correct.
Now we're saying 8.7, but that includes the incremental transfers to fleet and
Yes.
fleet and
Correct.
and insurance.
So if you figured
really,
nothing else, we would have went from 5.5 to 10.5 if you just add in those transfers. But because revenues are continuing to stay strong and trend up, it's not that bad, at least based on this projection. We think it'll fall somewhere in the middle, right around $8.7 million operating deficit.
I have a procedural question. So things like the animal shelter, skate park, Oakton, that didn't come to us first, right? That went straight to council and those were approved by council?
Correct.
In the
Yes.
future, is it something we can talk about as a committee here first? Because it does affect our reserves.
To the extent this committee can provide feedback on perhaps a policy for how to handle projects that come in over budget, but you hate to bring forward every capital project that comes in over budget. I mean, one of these finished $137,000.
I mean, I'm looking at the $1.5 million, the 806, 860, I mean.
Yeah, so
I
perhaps.
think when they're large projects, I think we should decide if it's over a certain amount that we absolutely should be discussing it to see if this is something that's feasible for our city and reasonable and responsible.
The broader thing would be, yes, as Clayton mentioned, you can decide, yeah, I mean, and particularly with the 5 council members on the committee, what are the criteria, you want? So you don't need, every 25,000, 50,000 project, something like that, and so you can have the broader criteria, and if the city council decides to go that route, those projects would be discussed here first before going to the city council.
Because once they're approved, our hands are tied. I mean,
No, I think that's fundamental, and that's where we end up with larger debts and everything else. So I would say if we, as part of the policies that we would discuss going forward, I think we should look at, what is the threshold in terms of expenditures, projected costs that we would discuss and make a recommendation. I think that's a great idea,
Yeah.
so.
The same thing is like, as I mentioned, there are 5 council members, so if it goes direct to the council, and if one of them even feels and accepted by it, that could come back to the finance, even if it's gone there, but it is ultimately up to the council.
But this is a focused venue for finance, so I think, I agree. I think we should determine that amount.
Do you want to flip up 2 slides? Is there any other questions about this fund balance slide? So if this $8.7 million deficit holds up, we would finish the year with $49 million in ending fund balance. Next year's budget uses $10 million of that, $10.5 million in order to be balanced. So we end up, if you skip to 2 slides from now, this would be the up one more. This is the trajectory that we're faced with. So the 2022 actual number was we finished 2022 with $57.8 million in the bank. Based on these projections and real numbers through the end of November, we think we'll finish with $49 million in the bank. If our budget is accurate for next year, we're using $10.5 million of that, and we would finish with $38.6 million. Et cetera. It would be a $10 million drain on this general fund balance based on actual results in 23 and budgeted planned spending in 2024.
And Clayton, of that 49 million, is that in addition to the reserve, or is that reserve plus?
So everything under the red line is the
Well,
reserve
the 49.
amount. So
The
it'd be about the
49
25. Just check and tell you.
So it's about 25 is above.
Of the 49 million, 23.6 million. Of the 49 million,
23 is fund balance. Okay,
23
I see
is
it here.
required fund balance.
Okay, so the rest of that is surplus above and beyond. Okay, so when you say with 10.5 million, that would mean over expenditures, right? Where we overspent.
Most of which is what is shown on, when I say we finished 10.5 million over, it's this list. And these are the reasons. And it was the adopted, we had already adopted
Right,
and planned
understood,
to
but
use
those
the-
are amounts that we're going to have to amend our budget for overspending by law, right? That's what we're going to have to do because we overspent, correct?
Correct,
Okay.
yeah. If you can go back to the fund balance projection slide. So again, as we said throughout the entire, that one's good. So as we talked about, and we do have a smaller slide here that kind of breaks down the categories and the numbers in the slide before this one. But this is kind of the graphical representation. So as we said during the budget process, we're going to finish 2023 with a strong fund balance. We're using a big amount of that fund balance in 23, and we're using a big amount of that fund balance to stay balanced in 24. This would be the trajectory if we continue to repeat that path.
But so that's assuming that we're accepting all the proposed capital investments
No, this is just in the general fund only.
by
where-
27.
Excuse me?
I mean, that's going up to 27.
But this is just in the general fund, 80% of which is staff salaries and wages, and the rest of it is not capital expenses.
So we're running, as shown by next year's budget, a structural deficit of $10 million a year, approximately, in the general fund. And that's what we have to arrest.
So, I mean, I think we have to be really clear. When we talk about 10 million, that's overspending. We made a budget that we then ended up with an enormous surplus, and staff overspent. Most cities, and this is where I'd love to see benchmarks, are not amending their budgets. They're staying within budget. We seem to have an issue discussing our budgets, passing a budget, and then sticking to our budget. So I would like to see us really have a goal of when we pass a budget by fund, and you know, that we have to stay within the fund, not funds within the funds, that we actually stay within it one year. We don't have amended. So I know last year we did something new where we reduced the previous year budget minus the amount that had been overspent. This year, is the plan to reduce last year's budget again, or are we going to amend it as we did in the past, where we would increase it by the amount that was overspent? Which way are we going to amend this year?
Look, our 23 budget was a deficit of $10 million. That was we're coming in before you get to the transfers to additional funds at a deficit of 5.5. So actually, net of revenues and expenses, there was about $5 million worth of favorability between budget and actual. Again, between revenues and expenses. And then we had the transfers to clean up the insurance fund and the fleet fund. So look, there's always pluses and minuses, and the budget gets adjusted for increases in expenses. We also had favorability in revenues. So I would say the performance, with a lot of puts and takes, the performance of budget to actual in 23 was pretty good. It was slightly favorable, which is probably where you want to be. And we, on top of that, took care of the historic insurance fund issue and the fleet.
So I would disagree. I think I think our levy is too high. I think that we're coming in with extreme surpluses, and I think what's happening is routinely this city does overspend, and then we amend the budget every single year to adjust for overspending without having it pre-approved. And you have to do that by law. You can't even by $1 overspend by those funds that are agreed upon. I would like to know, because I think it was particularly confusing last year, if the plan this year is to repeat what we did last year by reducing, because we'll reduce last year's budget based on the surplus, or will we amend to increase as we've done every year in the past?
We talked about it a lot throughout the budget process. Last year, we reduced two funds. We reduced ARPA because we budgeted $25 million and only spent $5 million. We reduced the water fund because we budgeted for a $50 million project that didn't get off the ground. This year, we again over budgeted in ARPA. We only spent $5 million of the 20 or so million. And the water project, again, was a little slow getting off the ground. So in both of those two funds, yeah, we underspent. We didn't issue the debt for the water intake project. We didn't spend our full ARPA cash balance. So once again, those two funds, yeah, we could probably reduce the budget in those two funds without talking about the details in the other funds, like general, where we clearly overspent because of these items on slide number 4. I don't think it'll look too much different from what we did last year.
So
probably reduce.
In ARPA and in water, two funds that are tied to very specific revenues unrelated to the general fund, we can likely reduce our budget.
Right, so we came in, last year was about 34 million. I think it was 34 that we reduced last year, our total budget. So this year, for last year now, what do you expect us to do?
As long as we understand that I'm only talking about ARPA and water, because I don't want to throw out some big wild number.
Well,
and
for the
that-
total
Talking about
budget.
the discretionary spending. Well, I think
I think it's
Councilmember
the total
Kelly is
budget.
talking about the capital projects in water, which by definition can move from year to year. That was primarily the reason why you have changes in the water fund, because the large capital projects get delayed. There's nothing untoward in that. It looks like an expense. A capital spending looks like an expense on the city's books. And if you underspend the capital but move it into the next year, you have to adjust the budget. And that's what you've been doing on water.
And
there's
it's
nothing
just
wrong with
important to
it.
know, because people look at your overall budget, and right, like ours looks really enormous at over 400 million now, and even when it was at, in '22, it was like 390 million, but we ended up reducing it all the way down to, I think, 370 into the 200s. So it's just to know actually what our budget will be saying that our 23 budget really was, our total budget.
Yeah, and that's work we'll do over the next couple of months. But I would forecast that in water and ARPA, we'll be able to reduce the budget again. It has no actual impact. It doesn't save
Right.
anybody any money. We've already rebudgeted those to 24, and we can reduce them for 23. Beyond that, we just need to dig in and see, were there funds where we may have overspent by 1,000 or a couple
But,
thousand?
I mean, is there any, I mean, what is the reason not to just simply amend our budget from 23 to increase it where there was over expenditures? I mean, why can't we simply do that?
Because then we'd be going from a $392 million budget to, say, $410 million, and we'd be increasing our total budget when we actually spent less than that.
Right, so we would just end up not having spent it. It remains in the balance sheet. We don't have to reduce our budget. It just simply becomes, excess, or it remains in the ARPA. We don't have to reduce, though. I think it's easier for everybody to understand if we're increasing our budget by where we overspent rather than reducing by where we didn't spend. And
Okay,
it just
and-
remains in the balance sheet.
Am I hearing you correctly? I mean, yes, and I think we mentioned when we did it after Clayton you started that, yes, in the past, City of Evanston did not do a budget amendment where the actual expenditure was less than budgeted. But particularly last year where the number was too high, and just to be transparent, because in ARPA and water, the amount was almost like 30 million combined. So we decided for a better transparency to include it. Now, if this committee and finally council feels that, okay, don't do that, just do the amendment where you have, because legally we need that, where we have exceeded, actual expenditures are higher than budget. We can change that, I have no problem. But we kept it because I know, consistently hear from council, the committee, the ward meetings, that better transparency, more and more out, tell us the story, So we try to do that. But we can change that.
But I think when people think about discretionary revenues and spending in the city, it's really the general fund, which is where the primary action is. And that's why we're trying to focus primarily on the general fund. The water fund in particular has very major capital expenditures going through it that look like current year spending when it's really long-term projects where you can easily have 10, 20, $30 million move from year to year just based on the timing of the capital project. So, but on this slide, I think the concerning thing here is if we have a $10 million structural deficit in the general fund, this march down that we will be below our required fund balance when we do the 25 budget. And some of that is property tax, some of it is other spending, but we have got to find a way to arrest this, what appears to be $10 million structural deficit. Now, last year, at the end of the day, the 10 that we budgeted ended up being 5 before we cleaned up the other reserves. So it is important during the course of the year that we have good readings on, are we at a $10, $11 million structural deficit in the general fund, or is it really something more like 5? Because 5 is obviously going to last a lot longer with respect to this unique, once-in-a-lifetime, large surplus that happened in 22 because of revenues being much stronger and open positions and lack of spending that really drove, gave us this large surplus in the general fund. It would just be, we don't want to squander this over a couple of years, that we ended up with 22 building up an enormous amount of excess reserves. We have to be stewards of that and not let those reserves that were generated in 22 be gone in 3 years. I think that would be completely mismanaged.
I think part of that, though, is giving direction to try to stay within budget. I mean, I think that's a completely reasonable direction. And this is, we have this deficit because we exceeded our budget in these funds. And I think there's, when we
No,
pass.
we didn't. We had a $10 million budgeted deficit in the general fund in 23.
But we exceeded funds. We're going to have to prove those. If we don't, we will be found illegal. We exceeded funds. I mean, to be clear, we exceeded, right? We have to amend the budget by those funds that we exceeded.
Well, there were
By
positive revenues and there's
Right, no, I understand there's
unfavorable
positive.
expenses.
No, that's not what I'm referring to. We have, if we don't amend our budget for where we exceeded in funds, we have to, as both, right, as they've said, as Clayton had just said, we have to amend it. We did overspend. So I think part of that is addressing, really trying to exercise some fiscal discipline and giving that sort of direction from the Finance and Budget Committee. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And that would help a lot to address this.
But the key is, we can't continue with the 5 to 10 million deficit, so, and, salaries are the biggest expense, I don't,
last year was an unusual year, primarily because of the new contracts with, was it 3 or 4 labor unions, right? That took dispense, But I think the city can be fairly proud of the fact that budgeted 10, enormous increases in the union contracts, and at the end of the day, we ended up, before those transfers, at a deficit of around 5. And, but it's because the revenues came in stronger, but there's always going to be pluses and minuses on revenue. So, but how do we, I just really hate that we ended up with a budget that is anticipating a $10 million deficit next year. And it's where we ended up on the discussion of property taxes and everything else. But we really need to know as soon as possible. We're really tracking to 11, because if we're tracking at 11, we have even more work to do relative to cost cuts. Because we don't want to just ride this thing down.
Last year, as I think noticed, the amended budget in general fund is the two main reasons. We transferred money to CIP since we did not issue the bond, but the projects were approved. And the other thing, the fleet and insurance was, approved by the city. And the wage increases. So that, like a 3 item. And again, this is what I have seen, just not here, but everywhere else. There is an emergency on the CIP work or some other work, or in general fund, some kind of an estimate. If the council approves that project, items, salaries, the position, and if we are over by 100,000 or $1 million, we have no choice. It's a direction from the
How
council.
is that message, though, exactly? I mean, do you come into council and say, this is what this is running at, but this is going to, we're going to be
No, we put that thing,
exceed
like
budget?
if you see the memos, everything, that's a funding source, and we say that this is not budgeted. So council knows fully well that, yes, we need this thing. We think that it is a staff recommendation, but it's not in the budget.
I would say we don't know it fully well. I think it would be helpful if you'd say, we're going to be exceeding budget on this. Can we get your, I would say it's not really, that's why I asked just now when we were at the bills pay list with APW, if we can routinely get an update like we're within budget. At this point in the year, we looks like we're exceeding or we're staying still within. I think we should be apprised of that at least quarterly at the APW when we're looking at our bills pay list, when we're looking at our salaries and our employee payments. I just think we need to have that idea, and I don't think it's always that clear. But I also want to say, I feel like, Chair Livingston, that you're really not acknowledging the surplus in the way that it needs to be acknowledged. To me, this is the bigger issue. And I know you want to think, well, this is all good, and this is great that we have such a surplus. I don't think when we're talking about a $25 million, and I think it would actually be larger, excess reserves on top of the reserves that we generated last year. I do think we need also a policy where we look at where there are increases of more than 20%, where staff is projecting an increase from the previous. We always have to go with the actual budget, not with the adopted, but with the actual budget from the year before, where we're seeing an increase in a line item of more than 20% to the following year. We need an explanation from that. And I think, Mr. Kennedy did, just really wonderful work in analyzing the budget and finding, nearly 100 items where some jumps were 100%, and we didn't have explanations. We can't just increase our budget without understanding why we're jumping when the actuals were, 20% or less the year before. So we really need to examine that and how we're charging our taxpayers, and if we are, if we need to levy the amount we're levying. I just think it's far from accurate right now, and the accountability is just missing. So I'm going to ask for that policy too. I'm going to make a list, and hopefully we can do a little bit of comparative. I've done some with some other communities, but I think we should not see so many jumps like, I mentioned insurance. The total amount that we're paying in insurance is just like 40% higher, I think is what we calculated overall. There should be an explanation for this, and I looked at industry levels, which were much lower than that. So I just think we can do a much better job of accountability for our residents in terms of what we're asking them to pay.
I'm not sure where to
Clayton,
pick
let's
up at this
proceed.
point,
I
unless you
think
want to
we're
go
pretty
to
much done with
the
your
projections. So if we just flipped into the budget slides, nothing here. If you go down, Hitesh, to slide 10, I believe. So we've included the fund balances from our monthly report. You've seen these charts in numerous presentations over the last 6 months, and so we've updated those to show funds that are doing well, how those funds that have fund balance policies are doing compared to policy. I highlighted the capital improvement program here. Capital improvement fund here. We already talked about it, but it does have a negative $5 million deficit at the end of November. In terms of the budget, it was adopted in December, and we just posted the adopted 2024 budget to the website last Friday. So it was available for viewing as part of the first city council meeting. This tracks where we started with expenses and where we finished with expenses. We started with $449 million, finished with $438 million in expenses. You can see here the 10 or so changes that were made throughout the budget process. Most notably, the CIP was significantly reduced from what was originally presented. The vacancy rate was increased from 2% to 4%, with those savings being used to offset the proposed property tax increase. And you can see the bottom 5 are sort of accounting procedures. It's transfer of money from the Good Neighbors Fund to the general fund, which was also used to help reduce the proposed property tax levy, as well as $1.5 million in new money in the Good Neighbor Fund to the Sustainability Fund and the Affordable Housing Fund. On the next slide, it shows the full list of changes that were made to revenues as part of the budget process. And you can see we started at $424 million, reduced GO bonds by $12 million. That was tied to the capital project reductions, eliminated the proposed 7.8% increase to the net property tax levy, and some other smaller changes throughout, including the $3 million in new money from the Northwestern agreement, of which $1.5 million was transferred to the general fund, as I said, and then $1 million to affordable housing, $500,000 to the sustainability fund. And that's sort of how we got to where we landed. In the general fund, on the next slide, you can see it landed with a deficit of $10.5 million, which I already talked about in that graph. That $10.5 million is covered through the reserve fund balance. Other measures taken to eliminate the property tax levy increase included additional savings from the increase in the vacancy rate and $1.5 million in new monies from Northwestern and the Good Neighbors Fund. The full budget's posted online if you want to take a look at it and see specific funds, line items, and everything else and where they landed. So, but these were, on these 2 slides, the only changes that were made to the budget from when we presented it to this committee in October through adoption in December.
And to be clear, I think budgeting a deficit of $10.5 million is way too much, right? And we discussed before that I think we would have been on a more sustainable long-term budget Had we done some degree of property tax increase, but it's not what the city council wanted to do, but eventually we're going to have to do that. It's just unsustainable to now, it will have been 4 years in a row without a property tax increase when that is one of our key discretionary revenue sources. We currently have excess reserves to be able to cover it, but as shown on this slide, that's only a couple of years. So,
And Claire, I like your idea because I've been thinking of this too, that, maybe even that August meeting or any budget item more than 20% or a dollar amount, like 20% or $1 million more than the previous year, we should have explanations because, every little bit does count on the 10 million, so.
Yeah, we talked through that with Mr. Kennedy. I think our threshold this year was a $10,000 increase, so each line item that increased by more than 10,000 should have had a memo attached to it unless staff could find a way to net that increase with a reduction somewhere else. So we've heard, from City Council and others that we'll keep track of that and continue to try to keep staff accountable for those 10,000 or more increases. And where we are able to net an increase here for a reduction here, at least track that so that we know this increase happened, but we reduced in this location.
And I think the benchmarking will help too on salary, like full-time equivalents and all those kinds of things, because that's a big, big part of our budget.
any other comments? Okay.
So, I'm sorry, so in terms of the amending last year's budget, will we be doing that at Finance and Budget next month, or what month do we expect to amend the 23?
It could be the March or the April, because we are still, sometimes, the revenues doesn't matter, but this is related to the expense, and we get the invoices as late as February and in March from some of the contractors and where. And I cannot come because particularly some of the funds where we have the CIP projects like water, sewer, CIP fund itself, the contractors would be late in submitting the invoices. So go ahead.
So you're saying that but we're not going to pay in arrears? I mean, if we're getting a bill and, we're going to pay it this year. So I'm just trying to understand why. I know that some, I know the PPRT, for example, the January payment comes in for December, but some, you're suggesting that there's some payments we make as late as March, that's.
Yeah, the bills come later, but that's why we have to keep the books open all the way until June, because, we give the first set of data to the auditors in mid-April, and they look at it, and if they find it, but yes, they are charged back to the 23. Even if I get a $1 million invoice from a contractor, I look at the invoice, see whether the work was done in 23. I have to book it to 23. Same thing with the fleet, whether they came delivered in 24 or 23, that decides where it is charged. The date of delivery is sometimes, the fleet they have ordered 6 months ago, but if they come in February or March, they would be charged to 24 budget. So sometimes those items throw the budget to actual numbers off too.
Okay, so March or April, we'll see the amended budget. Okay.
One comment I would have is, a lot of this will be moot if we're building this, these new huge buildings. I guess I don't understand why we wouldn't have a special meeting just to, I don't really want it just tacked on to the February meeting, is it? I think we need to have a special meeting to talk about that because it's huge, and just sort of to have us be kind of getting that information.
I think Luke just sent the email that there is a kind of an extensive discussion at the January 22nd City Council meeting about the Civic Center. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think to Sherry's point, because we're talking potentially upwards of $100 million, maybe $200 million, that we should absolutely be having that discussion here. So I would second that we schedule a special meeting for that ASAP.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of times we're sort of just, an afterthought, no, here's the information. We're supposed to be on the front end of these things.
I can check with Luke and I'll see that at least I would wait until January 22nd, what the discussion happens at the City Council. Is there any specific direction, exploring any other further options? And based on that, I think, we can touch on that and whether, we want to meet and talk about it.
I do think it's important. I know there was a roundtable article, and there's been, I think Jonathan Newsma mentioned at his ward meeting, and I'm hearing a lot about it from residents. I think we should be addressing this sooner than later here at the Finance and Budget Committee. So I would like to see us go ahead and plan on that either for early February or late January.
Let's have our scheduled February meeting and decide if we need an additional February meeting to go over what is discussed on the 22nd. You're not going for approval on the 22nd, presumably. It's just to discuss the scope of the potential projects. And again, I think people need to understand, here's why do we have the needs on these 3 buildings, and then what are the solutions?
Have you started moving personnel to other buildings?
No.
No?
And at least my knowledge, and that's why, I think you mentioned some email, there were 2 items where I think I'm hesitant to talk about. One is a Northwestern Stadium thing, that where we are and all those legal, and the second thing is about Civic Center, police headquarters. There are so many options, It's not
There's
just,
a lot in the papers, and people are
Yeah.
coming up to me, and I don't know the
A lot of
answers, so.
disinformation.
and
so-
even if the council decides, particularly like after they, go this direction, first thing would be explore, right? What we do, what's the best option, combine 2 operations, 1 place. So there are so many kind of moving parts, and it takes its own time before we kind of say, yep.
It's a
And again,
multi-year consideration.
Okay.
So.
And again, I would request the chair and the other committee members, other than the council members, because they will be there on January 22nd, I think the looks and the email, that there will be an extensive discussion. So that might help,
Good.
So
Okay.
before we
Is there
adjourn, I just have a thing separate from this, but can we, with agendas, is it possible just to share a doc, not that can be edited, but just so we can kind of see it and make sure? So that would be great. I mean, sort of a live, not a live document that others can edit, but so if I can
Circulate
see
it before. Okay.
That would be great.
That's
And
good.
then,
Good thing.
in terms of, Michael, do you have an idea as to a timeline when you might have that sort of presentation of comparable cities?
My guess is for February, we'll have some sort of, update on that and with,
On what the cities are.
Yeah,
we won't
exactly,
have data on the
and again,
benchmark.
getting more feedback if this is a good, we'll figure that out. Yeah, I would say,
Okay.
if there's
Again, it's
specifics
a
you want us
list-
to look into in the short term.
It's a list to get started, that once we
Correct.
then start collecting data, we can always expand the list. But let's get our most critical peer communities defined.
Yeah, that'd be great. And the other item that I forgot in terms of comparable is Evanston is really high in terms of tax exempt property. So we are extraordinarily high. I think we're at about 1/3 of our property is tax exempt, which is way above others. So it might be interesting to also look at 1 or 2 cities, if you can find any, that have a high portion of tax exempt property.
I will not promise getting that for February, but.
Okay, all right, very good. Okay, so I think with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.